Okay. All right. I'm Christopher Martin. I am a digital journalism professor at the University of Northern Iowa. I'm 56. Let me see what else. So about the book. I've been actually researching the intersection of media and labor in the working class probably since the early 1990s. So I started actually looking at this topic when I was a PhD student at the University of Michigan. And that was kind of its location is actually relatively important. There was a big GM shutdown that was happening in the early 90s. There were things happening throughout the Midwest, like at the A.E. Staley Corporation in Illinois. And so there was a lot of activity in terms of labor and kind of some hits on organized labor at that time. So it's been an interesting question for me. I wrote my dissertation on it. That became an earlier book, Framed, ! Labor in the Corporate Media, that I wrote for Cornell University Press. And this book, The Invisible Worker, is kind of a follow-up to that many years later.
Yeah, I can relate. I mean, I'm in my mid-30s, but I've lived long enough where, looking back, like I've seen the things that I've observed or grown up in, like the way that it's like had a deep imprint on my DNA, and just like the things that I'm driven to explore as a journalist. So we have a fair amount of overlap here. I always know when I reach out to people to talk about video game stuff or something, at least stemming at least abstractly from video game stuff, that there might be an initial like, oh gosh, I don't know anything about games. It's always helpful though to hear about just like what perceptions of the space are. I'm just sort of curious, like if you have heard anything, or if you've heard nothing, that's good too. Like I'm just curious, like if you have any awareness or any perception of that dynamic in the video game industry, as far as media and labor in the game space. Are you aware of anything, or have you heard anything at all?
Not a lot. I mean, I know that, I think the games themselves and the launches of the games get a lot more press than the people behind them. I mean, I think there's this idea in our culture, and kind of a mythology of the young hackers, usually male hackers, that make these games.
Right.
That they're brilliant and they're just kind of sitting behind their computers and writing code and making these amazing games. But there's very little coverage, at least in the mainstream press, about the people who make them, their working conditions, and that sort of thing. And I think, and that's actually too bad. I mean, and part of it is just the overall environment and kind of atmosphere of labor journalism right now. There's just not very much of it. So in the top 25 newspapers, only about 6 of them have full-time dedicated labor reporters, which is really, historically, going back to the mid-20th century. I mean, that's really not how the coverage has been. But it's just really not a question of interest. I think there are news organizations that are taking up that beat a little bit more now, mostly digital outlets like Politico and Bloomberg and HuffPost. Some of those titles are actually taking up a labor beat, realizing that it's really important. It helps to explain a lot of what we've been talking about in this country about inequality, going back to protest around Wall Street, more than 10 years ago. So I think there is a recognition that there's been a big story that they've missed, and that they need to start covering that a little bit more.
Are you speaking, as far as like a story that's been missed, are you speaking about just like the capital V video games, like topics about those, or do you mean capital L labor as the probably the bigger umbrella that video games also would fall under?
Yeah, I think just that the bigger story would be about labor, and inequality, and how did we get to the point where, it was just in the news in the past week where, we have the richest, 0.01% paying a lower rate in taxes than the working class. How there became such a, not this point since the 1920s, an inequality between the richest and the poorest in America. So, I mean, that covers, the entire working class in the United States, but it also speaks to the conditions of people who make video games. And I think those people in particular are still getting overlooked. I think there is within the labor beat, and when the mainstream news media covers labor, there's kind of there's the myth of this working class to them usually means a white guy, wearing a hard hat or, in some kind of industrial type of profession or mining profession or something like that. And that's that's a really old myth or vision of what someone in the working class would be like. I mean, so they tend to discount people who might have higher levels of education, which could be someone who's making a video game, because they don't even seem like they're working class to them. So it kind of, in some ways, that educational status kind of isolates them and insulates them from being thought about as someone who might be working in not great labor conditions. I think teachers have actually had a difficult time with that until just recently in the past 2 years when they really kind of come out in a big way, and they're actually our best educated people who belong to labor unions to the biggest extent. And so they've been protesting, and it's like, here's people with master's degrees who are not getting paid well, who have to, spend hundreds or thousands of dollars a year to put supplies in their classroom. And people just kind of don't pay attention to that because they don't think like, well, that's not the working class. Plus teachers, over 70% of them are women too, so people don't pay attention to them to that extent too.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like, yeah, I don't know, because I think there's where we come together and overlap on this call. Like, what I have really sort of been struck by the deeper I've been digging with this project is, you mentioned like, oh, there are all these stipulations, sort of these reasons that people, I don't know, like they act like the lack of journalism is almost like warranted or it's merited in some way, and I don't know if like, is that just some sort of human thing? Like, are we rationalizing about something? I think well, if video games were important enough, then why would they have this issue? Because that's sort of a whole other side topic. It's just there can be this myopia when it comes to video games where it's like, well, I don't care about games, and I've had that experience as a journalist, trying to pitch these stories. Never mind just the difficulty of getting a labor force comfortable to or willing to cooperate when it's their livelihood on the line, to participate in the story and to talk about all sorts of practices. So I mean, I wonder like how much of this is a journalism thing and how much of this is just boy, there's something about humans that we don't want to look at, just like the tendency we have to not care about other people.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's really a question in there, but this has really been on my mind,
Well, I think those things do, go hand in hand, like not caring about certain people, but also, where journalism thinks what constitutes a story. And I think, the other thing about, people who make video games, the video game industry, is that it's kind of not in our view. I mean, it's been in my experience of doing research on the media coverage of labor unions and the working class. So the people who are most visible oftentimes get the most attention. So, for example, there was in the late 1990s, a big strike by UPS workers, and that was actually, they were pretty effective because people tend to know who does the work. I mean, you actually see, people who do UPS deliveries, and if you get a lot of deliveries, you actually know you're a UPS delivery person. Same thing with, people who work in the Postal Service. Same thing actually with teachers. So that was an advantage they had as well. And you generally know who the K through 12 teachers of your kids are. But with people who make video games, and we generally do not see them, on a regular basis. They're kind of, away in offices somewhere behind a computer doing their work. So they're not like really a visible part of communities. And they tend to be, more aggregated in certain areas of the country as well. They're not diffused throughout the country. So people, if you ask, a general person who makes video games, it's likely that they don't know anyone like that. Whereas they might know, someone who, who teaches in schools or who delivers their parcels and things like that. So the only way then to get visibility would actually be, and this is what is effective, and it's proven historically, is actually to protest and to make yourself visible. That's the only way that people are really going to know who who's doing that sort of thing. So, so it'd be nice if journalists went out and actually were thinking about that. They oftentimes, are busy and oftentimes just aren't engaged enough in covering that area enough to know actually what's going on. So unless you actually get it in front of them, the mainstream media is not going to do that, particularly at a time when we don't have a really stocked labor beat.
Right. I mean, like when it comes to the video game specific stuff, I feel like it's almost this sort of perfect storm of unfortunate circumstances where, you bring up the mainstream media, and then I think that that's a point of contention, right? Like, is mainstream media doing, what are they doing a good job of? And can you get, two random people who would agree on that, much less a larger contingency? Because, I don't really think I'm the only roving independent journalist who has noticed this and is interested in this. I might be unusual in that I've spent the last 5 years just talking to as many people as I can for no reason other than I'm interested and I had the time and I want to put it out there. But part of that is, I think deeper philosophical problems that the media is now facing, just over and all, just the media in general. And there's also, there's budgetary concerns, there's all sorts of things. But I had just run into this thing in the last couple of years. I struggle to figure out a way to talk about this without it seeming like I'm complaining or feel sorry for myself. It's been very difficult to find editors really anywhere who are interested in this stuff. I had a whole saga about 3-4 years ago where I spent a year pitching just a story about why doesn't the video game industry unionize? Because it feels it's in the shadow of other entertainment industries, but it sort of looks up to these other entertainment industries that have unions. And I understand the labor works differently, but I think that's a decent, even 101 level article that even people outside of the space can understand. But at that point in time, it was too much about video games for more mainstream facing publications, and it was too much about people for video game publications. I had one place express an interest, and then they sort of got cold feet, and they said, let's just hold off on this until, quote, the topic of labor comes up. And it's well, aren't people going to work every single day? So I don't want to tell you this sob story, but I'm mainly curious, and a big reason I do these interviews is just to try to figure out well, how are we repeating the past? I tell you about that saga, and I'm just curious, does that remind you of some earlier era of journalism? Does that remind you of some other industry that's been kind of in the periphery but just can't seem to connect in that way? Or are video games truly exceptional in this regard?
No, I think there's a lot of industries where that would be a problem. I think most industries don't get good coverage. Again, I mean, we've seen just recently fairly, I don't know, not even really decent coverage actually of the GM UAW strike, and that was a huge one. There was more than 49,000 people who were out on strike until just recently for several weeks, and it got some coverage in the media, but not ongoing coverage. Not that what you would have seen maybe 30 or 40 years ago. And part of it again is just that there's not that labor beat to cover it. But I think you would have a difficulty in similarly in trying to get any coverage kind of starting from ground up on what's happening in terms of labor in the video game industry, because there's just not. You're right. I mean, people tend to cover it from the about the games, and there's lots written about that. But there's not a lot written about about labor in those games. And the problem is there's not a lot written about labor, and that's an area where there's not a great history of labor. I mean, so there are so we've had a history of them writing about auto workers, but there's not a big history. And as you mentioned, one other thing, just the budgetary conditions for the journalism industry. So there's there's not a big labor beat, and there's not a lot for a lot of newspapers and other organizations, there's not a lot of money to create or expand that beat. So so it's kind of a great irony at this point where we're at have this incredible inequality, yet there's not a regular beat to cover that, and it happens in all industries. And from the outside in, you might think, well, people in the video game industry are doing fine. I mean, I don't see or hear about them, so people just assume that that's okay, and they don't really know the conditions about what's going on there. But
yeah,
so it sounds like editors are trying to look for some kind of news peg, but there's not going to be a news peg unless that coverage is started initially, or maybe they're just waiting for the people to organize or to start protesting, and you're writing about like why that's not happening. To me, that sounds like a really good story, but some people are just kind of afraid to go with the news story unless there's some kind of news peg or prior thing, which unfortunately is kind of not how journalists should be approaching that story, right? I mean, we shouldn't be doing more of the same thing. It's actually nice to break stories when no one's been covering them.
Yeah. Gosh, I mean, I'm just trying to figure out what to ask next, because like my saga with all that, for example, was before Me Too, before there was, I think, a little bit more of an explosion of like interest in like, oh gosh, look at what stories we have not been covering. Mm-hmm. And obviously, Me Too is a positive thing, and it's brought about all this change, and it's changed the types of conversations that people have about work. But I feel, or what I've noticed is something that's gotten lost in that is people kind of forget the degree to which the media was a part of that story, and sort of NBC's reluctance to run that. I don't know if you've noticed that as well. I just don't know if like there are certain tendencies about the media, like it's popular to slam on the media and say, oh, such and such publication sucks, but that feels like a forgotten part of the story to me, and I think that I feel like that's kind of indicative of I don't know, in a way, like almost like what we expect from media, or maybe it's just it was such a huge story that it overshadowed it. I don't know. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, well, I think that the Me Too story, certainly had it had pretty good legs because they were familiar and well-known characters to it to get it going. Once it did get going, obviously, if you've been listening to Ronan Farrow recently, talking about his new book, it was hard to get that off the ground at NBC because of non-disclosure agreements and kind of being browbeaten by Harvey Weinstein. But I think there was an element of that it actually did take a while to get off the ground, but it became a relatively big story, the Gamergate story, and there is certainly a Me Too element to that, or certainly talks about sexism in the industry and the treatment of women in the industry, and that became a pretty big story. I don't know if the average person in America would know that story, but if you follow media or technology or the digital game industry, you would be aware of that one, and that seems to be kind of an interesting entry point. It's not mostly from a labor angle, but it's more from at least women who work in the industry angle. Mm-hmm. So it kind of takes a different approach to talking about that. But that's just one. That's one. It's a really important facet. That's one facet of labor relations in the digital game industry. But there's a lot more to talk about. Just workers in general, male and female, and their connection to the people who own things in the industry. So that's another story to tell.
Well, yeah, and I think too with these topics, it's very easy out of the gate to be, I don't know, it almost feels disrespectful to say doom and gloom, but these are heavy topics, and they're topics where it's very clear where people can be doing better. But it's tempting, and it's almost comfortable to be like, oh, this is terrible. It's never going to get better. The media is awful. All bosses are exploitive. I don't know if this is a thing you've heard. I've heard this in my circles, or at least among readers, where I don't know if it's in reaction to just the last couple of years and the climate of everything, but I have sensed that readers now expect journalism to provide hope or to be a source of optimism, which I want to talk about. But I'm just curious in general, like where do you see points of optimism? Like, what do you look to as like a sort of like a hit of Prozac or something when you're thinking about this stuff? Like, are you hopeful about this, or is this not the way that you think about it when it comes to just like the job that media is doing and the dominoes from there?
Well, in general, I mean, I love journalism. I always tell people journalists are my heroes, and there's some really great journalism that continues to happen, even while the industry is kind of going through a great transition and trying to figure out how to monetize the digital kind of journalism.
Yeah.
But I think, I think there's a lot to be optimistic about. There's a lot to be optimistic about on the labor beat and kind of or the workplace or work beat. It's also called. I mean, there's some interesting things happening. I mean, it's not happening in a big way, but I think there's some really great stories that are coming out. That are covering labor and kind of in some ways making up for lost ground of the past couple decades where that stuff wasn't being paid attention to. Because I think we got to the point of the crash in 2007, 2008, and then the recovery from that, and just increasingly people were asking, like, how did this happen? Why is the working class and the middle class not doing well in America, even as the wealthiest are actually doing quite well. So it's not, so if you look at Wall Street, everything's great. If you look, to use that cliche, Main Street, I mean, people aren't doing so well. And I think
that's a phrase. That's a phrase I've not heard in a long time. Main Street, yeah.
Yeah, the Wall Street versus Main Street. Yeah, maybe it's living in Iowa. I hear that sort of thing.
No, it's okay. I recognize it. Yeah.
But I think it's actually in. Certainly in the political discourse now, and so that's kind of a good thing because it actually puts it in some ways on the agenda of people who are doing the writing. It certainly hasn't, it certainly doesn't mean that there's going to instantly be great reports about, about the game industry and what's happening there. But I am starting to see more and more emphasis, still somewhat limited, but some really good stories about what's happening in terms of labor and class in the United States. So I'm optimistic in that regard. I think, there's a lot of different ways people are trying to figure out how to fund journalism now. There's an increasing number of nonprofits that are popping up, and that's actually a good way to do journalism. That's not so much affected by the fluctuations of the economy. Yeah. So there are things that are happening. I mean, we could use a lot more. I mean, it's still an area that's not covered. And what I argue in my book is that, the problem of the media over, since the 1970s has been the mainstream media has been their, general focus on more upscale audiences. So if you're writing stuff about upscale audiences, you're writing, you're really not talking about the working class in America. And even, and I would argue that people who make games, probably aren't thought of by a lot of people as the working class because it doesn't fit that stereotype, unfortunately. But I think it doesn't mean you can't, be treated badly and compensated badly in that job. It just means that people are thinking. I'm sure that the mythology is like they're thinking about, young, mostly men, again, behind computer screens and, who are well educated and, and they're doing that job, and how could that possibly be a bad thing? But unless you know more about that industry, you might just think that that's no big deal if they don't like their job. Yeah. This is kind of the anti-labor thing. If you don't like this job, just do what Johnny Paycheck said a long time ago: take this job and shove it, go on to the next thing. But that never fixes the problem, right? No. It just fixes might fix your individual problem, but not everyone can do that.
Right.
And so I would hope that people would start paying more attention to that because it's certainly important, and it's a huge industry. It's an industry that certainly rivals the film industry and the television industry, and I think it certainly deserves attention.
Yeah, I mean, in the past, when I've written about it, I've used the word invisible when it comes to this particular labor group, and I never know if, in hindsight, I mean, word choices matter. It affects the way people think of things. I never know if that's too melodramatic. Like I've talked to other writers or other people who have noticed this as well, and they've come up with some pretty great comparisons. I do think, whether you call it invisible or not, I think it's a labor group that's not really thought of. I don't think it's a labor group people realize that they can think about, much less that it can be covered. I've heard other people compare it to it's like the people who fill your printer cartridges with ink. Like we never think about like how did that get there? Can you think of a time, like through your research, like a labor group like that sort of materialized itself in some way in the public consciousness?
That's a good point. I think, and this is kind of a much bigger group, but again, just recently, I think teachers have really, and this is a huge, hundreds of thousands of people who've been organized for decades, but I think they've really there's not really been much attention paid to them by the news media until just recently, in a number of states when, they put on Red for Ed T-shirts and were protesting and took their protest to state houses. I think we really hadn't paid much attention to what was happening with public school teachers across the country. So,
right.
But it took them not just locally. I'm sure that there were complaints all across the country, but it actually took them pushing their fight into a very visible location and into the political realm and making a big deal out of it. So it actually, that speaks to the challenges. If a group that's organized, that is that organized and that visible, and that we tend to know our K through 12 teachers.
Yeah.
And they had to go to that much extent to get anything. I mean, it really speaks to the challenges of a less visible industry. And I think invisible, what you said, actually is very apt.
Yeah.
To try to get attention and try to get someone to pay attention to them. And it seems like to be visible, to be protesting, to organize or to attempt to organize would bring more attention to what's going on. But I don't know enough about the way that the industry is organized. But if the challenge is if it's very diffuse, it's much harder to organize. I mean, that's something that happened in the auto industry. Back in the 1930s, there were, huge, the sit-down strike that happened in Flint. And that was incredibly effective because it was a massive production facility, and one sit-down strike just kind of crippled the entire auto industry in the 1930s. But what's happened since that time in the auto industry is that it's become much more diffuse. So there's workers, in smaller plants, and and other plants that actually just work for, GM or Chrysler or Ford, and so, that outsource the work. So it's really hard to get everyone together to have a huge strike. And so that, the one that happened, recently was, just slightly less than 50,000 workers, and that's not as massive as strikes used to be in the auto industry. So I think when industries tend to be diffuse, it's very hard to organize. Another one that might be maybe even more relevant would be, trying to organize fast food workers, because again, they're diffuse, right? You only have so many working at each McDonald's, for example, and so because they're not all in one central location, it's much more difficult to organize people, and for them to, so what happened in those protests and the Fight for 15 is they just went to certain locations in New York, in Seattle, and elsewhere, and then got people to protest in very visible, downtown locations, and that seemed to be more effective. But if you go strike at McDonald's, in a small town, in New Mexico or Iowa or downstate Illinois, it's not going to get very much attention. So you really have to do it in a very visible location, and then you might get the attention of the media to cover that.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I think about too with media and this story in general, in the grander sense, is I thought about it with really since Me Too, is this feeling that, well, or my noticing that anyway, that there might be this feeling that that if we want social change, to try to, it's almost like people used to talk about 15 or 10 years ago, wanting to go viral, like having a hilarious video or having some, like the old David Letterman thing, like stupid pet tricks or some sort of thing where like the goal was to just get, millions of hits, before there was any sort of pipeline of like, oh, that thing from the internet is now a book. Now I really feel like people think the way to get their plight noticed is to try to, like there was even a thing last week in Hollywood, with show business assistants, with hashtag pay up. I mean, it seems like people are not, like it feels to me like media has gone from being proactive to reactive, and I constantly see posts, I guess they're articles, that just have like, 10 to 15 tweets embedded rather than doing original reporting. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that speaks to like where media is heading. I don't know if it just speaks to a particular low point or turning point to media. Like we talked about, optimism, but there is also this other opposing attitude I've heard. Maybe it's just because it's the opposite as a binary. I have a lot of friends who support what I do, and still, they'll say like, "Oh, we should just let the media destroy itself."
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I don't really think social media is to blame there. I don't really know what the question is there. I don't know if you've observed these things. It's hard to tell when you're online covering a particular thing. Do other people see this too? Is it just this corner of the internet? Or is that your sense of it as well?
Yeah, no, that seems to be a problem. It's just kind of, quick, I don't know, I guess kind of lazy coverage. And I think, I don't want to suggest that journalists are lazy, but it actually is an offshoot of just the lack of staffing at a lot of journalism organizations. So I'll give you an example, actually. In the Twin Cities, there are two, major newspapers. It's the Minneapolis Star-Tribune and the St. Paul Pioneer Press, and they were always, big rivals for decades. At this point, the St. Paul Pioneer Press is doing incredibly well. They had a very wealthy person buy the newspaper and then just kind of stand back and let it run. And so they have, a couple hundred people on their editorial staff. I mean, it's a great newspaper. They've got lots of money and people to cover things. On the other side is the St. Paul Pioneer Press, which is now owned, by a private equity company, which everything else that they buy, they tend to, slash staffs and just try to wring as much profit as they can without putting any investment into it. And so it's a really unequal relationship now that the Star Tribune's doing really well. The Pioneer Press, has a few dozen editorial employees, and it's really tough. I mean, they rely a lot on interns just to do basic stories. So, and it just makes a huge difference who the owner is. So it's kind of a deep pockets owner who kind of gives them free reign at the Star Tribune, and the Pioneer Press is one of the many newspapers across the country that's been bought by a private equity company, and they do very little investing and just kind of, wring out profits. And so I imagine there's a lot less that can happen with the St. Paul Pioneer Press. They generally can't do big stories, and so I don't know if this is their situation exactly, but I know, when news organizations get pressed, for time and don't have the number of people, then they start doing, quicker, easier stories that rely on tweets and things like that. And that's just not what you want to do when you're doing reporting, is kind of have something like that.
I don't know. I mean, I think, none of these things are in a vacuum. I know there are other people who feel like with internet, with social media, with whatever, like the fact that like I've been doing this project so long and that people find it so fascinating, I find is a little discouraging because it's just two people talking to each other, and that feels so alien to so many people. But I do know a lot of people who are like, yo, I want to order food, for example, and I'm too awkward to get on the phone, so I'll just do it through an app. Like I do think that there is that streak in our culture of a reluctance to, gosh, I don't want to have a confrontational conversation with someone I don't really know to get a quote. I'm not calling people lazy either. I do think that there is sometimes a streak of that, especially if you're getting paid, $20 per post or something like that. It's like, well, why would I go out of my way to do more? I don't know if with your research you know this. I always try to ask. I asked it when I was more heavily looking at the Gamergate side of things and just the online toxicity. This I actually don't know. I mean, I wonder how much of this sort of disconnect with labor reporting, the lack of it. I don't know. Is that a distinctly American problem? Are there other regions or cultures or countries that are better at it and better at identifying what the problems are and actually holding people accountable? Or is this just sort of a global thing?
Yeah, it's there is better labor reporting in Europe, so that I'm aware of. I don't really follow labor reporting
Sure.
in South America or Asia very closely, but it is actually pretty good in Europe, and just because a lot of people belong to labor unions, there's labor parties, and so that there tends to be a media that pays attention to that sort of thing there. Canada is kind of interesting, our neighbor to the north, and so there's a higher level of labor membership there, so it's still around 30%. Yet there's not really good labor reporting in Canada, and part of that is because there are few owners, and they tend not to be labor supporters. There's few owners of media in Canada, so that's been a problem with them for a couple decades. So the problem tends to be, not only is labor important in that country or not, but it also, to a greater extent, tends to be who owns the media. And when there's bigger corporations, when there's more consolidation in the news media, they tend to pay less attention to the working class and labor unions, which is interesting. One thing I point out in the book, so there is, in the conservative media in the United States, like Fox News and shows on the radio like Rush Limbaugh, they do pay attention to working class issues, but not labor issues. So, in fact, I argue their rise since the 1970s to the 80s and 90s was paying attention to that audience that was forsaken in the mainstream media,
right.
The working class. But they don't cover them from economic perspective. They cover them more from a cultural perspective. So what you get in the conservative media is kind of an appeal to at least some working class, mostly white working class people, from a perspective about grievances, and usually cultural grievances. So it has to do with feminazis, as Rush Limbaugh would say, or it would have to do with the abortion issue, or it would have to do with something like the war against Christmas, the alleged war against Christmas. So things like that are about cultural issues and kind of I guess divide off the working class from the rest of the society, over these aggrieved, usually white grievances and cultural issues. So even they're not covering it from an economic perspective, and if they did, we'd have a very different Republican Party, I suppose, too. So
yeah. It's funny you mentioned that, because something else I wanted to ask about, because that's the thing I'm always trying to do with this, is to try to, where I can, sort of loosen those laces of that thinking that which came from an insecure place, because video games had sort of been picked on culturally or blamed for so much for so long. There's this desire, I know, in writers and journalists, because again, sort of like you point out in your book, it's clear where the deficiencies are, and it's clear where the opportunities are to try to do good and to try to help others and to just try to write these stories that are out there, Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I mean, I have a couple of theories about why this is, but something I've noticed and have talked about with others is there can be this kind of territorial, almost adversarial nature that I think maybe journalists have in general. They don't want to get scooped. They want to have the great story. But that seems to be pretty rampant in the video game space, where I don't know, like writers don't want to like they want to be the one to plant the flag, to break the story open, and openly get angry or try to poke holes when other people write types of stories. And I don't know if it's just because there's so little to go around that it creates for such a, it's not even competitive. It's because it ultimately just drags everybody down. But I was just wondering if there was another writer pool or another industry where you noticed that kind of tendency, and I don't know, if it ever resolved itself, or because I just don't believe that video games are exceptional in every way imaginable. I'm sure this has happened elsewhere.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I would guess there's a similar kind of thing in the. It's another public industry, but just the entertainment industry in general. I mean, people want to kind of plant the flag in the ground first and kind of claim that they did something, and so it's pretty competitive in that regard. In the TV industry, the film industry, the music industry, I think people tend to be pretty competitive and want to kind of claim a ground first.
Yeah.
So, and maybe that's just kind of because those are all things that are very public. So there's a certain cachet to being, the innovator, the presumed innovator, the person who got the story first.
I don't know. I mean, I think these things run pretty deep, and they can wind up being pretty nefarious, even while they're pretty subtle. I was talking about word choice with invisible, and I think about this stuff a fair amount, but something I had never thought about until I read your book was just the choice of words, workers' demands versus management's offers. I don't know. I feel like that's a parallel to, because I don't know if we mentioned it so far, but your book talks about media outlets wanting to have a more, I don't know if it's white collar readership, but a more well-to-do readership. But I feel like this disconnect has gotten to this place where even when places like the New York Times write about blue collar issues or blue collar workers, it's well, here's how people who have no savings live. Can you believe it? Where it's almost like an anthropological lens that even it perpetuates the distance.
Absolutely, yeah.
So how did we get to this place where we don't even realize it's happening? Because I think about this stuff all the time, and I never thought about that.
Yeah. Well, the word choices you make, there's that concept I talk about is framing, how you frame a story, and if you start paying attention to see how the news media frames certain stories, it really kind of gives away, their perspective, because the way you frame a story kind of suggests who the important actors are, what are important storylines, but also suggests what the solutions could be.
Yeah.
And when you limit the frame or set a frame, and oftentimes it's an unconscious thing. They're kind of when you frame a story, you kind of go in with certain kinds of ways of thinking, and it actually can be very limiting if you're not self-aware of what you're doing to that story. So when you start talking about workers' demands while business offers, I mean that really frames a story in a certain way and suggests who are the good people and who are the bad people in that story.
Or reasonable versus unreasonable is the way I take it from your book. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's very it can be very subtle, but it also that frames the entire story and kind of suggests to people how they should think about that. And so if you hear a lot of that as you're reading a story, and it's always workers demanding stuff, and the business is offering things. I mean, it makes workers sound like they're asking for too much. They're being greedy, and they're they're going to hurt business, and that's not a good thing. And if you do a story and you talk only to people who are affected by a strike or a shutdown and their inconveniences, then it's they should be done with the strike, and they should get done with it. We should, stop the lockout and let them keep producing whatever they're producing, because I'm angry that they don't do that anymore. So it might be an airline strike, and I just want to be able to go from point A to point B, or it might be a strike making I don't know. I mean, we've had like before TV writer strikes,
right?
And then it would be like I wanted to get my programs back. So if you're constantly talking about and framing the story around the customer, that's never good for the working class or labor, because it makes them just want to get back to consuming, and it doesn't make the audience see themselves as fellow workers. So what happens in the GM strike, for example, might mean a lot to people in other industries, because what they were trying to do is get rid of this 2-tier wage system, which was kind of a carryover from times when GM wasn't doing as well. So when GM's doing really well, you would think we'd want to get rid of that system, but they wanted to stick with it, and so it actually took workers going on strike to kind of get rid of that. So that the framing is really important, and it, as you you can see that in news coverage of any industry in any kind of worker situation. So it might be interesting to look at how, and I've not done this, but look at how the gaming industry stories are framed, and how they seem to think about workers and what their role is.
It's funny because I don't even know. I say funny. I'm not sure that's the right word. A lot of stories about labor issues in games, sort of, there was a prototypical thing that happened about 10 years ago where somebody published an anonymous post on LiveJournal about how their spouse works at Electronic Arts, and they never see their spouse because they're working all the time, and they can't talk about what they do at work, which is true. There are very aggressive NDAs to the point where, like, I mean, I've talked to people. It's almost like absurdist, the levels that the NDAs go to, where like you can't talk to people in other departments about what you're working on.
Wow.
I mean, I've heard all these horror stories where, like, I talked to a unionizing expert at Stanford. I mean, it's so extreme that he was skeptical that any of the stuff I was telling him was even true. But I've talked to enough people to get a sense of, like, yeah, this shape of stuff is what's going on. But there's a word from this post about 10 years ago that people have latched onto, which is crunch, and that tends to be the way that people, like, that's sort of the accepted sort of only way people are able to think about, like, the way game companies are being exploitive. And crunch basically, I mean, it basically means bad management, but it basically is like these periods of extreme uncompensated overtime to meet milestones. And, I know people who work in TV and film, and I think journalism has it too. I feel like all fields have this, but there's some sort of exceptionalism streak in video games where they think this is the only problem. They think that it's there's only one way to talk about the problem. And it weirdly, like, I haven't figured out a way to really broach this with people in the space, because it's an upsetting problem, and they're not really receptive to the fact that it's preventing, like, other problems from even being discussed. Obviously, it's horrible. But I think in general too, like talking about disconnect, something I was thinking about is in this dynamic. Like, I think in general, the mindset of media can be fairly liberal, and the mindset of people who run companies is fairly conservative. So there's like they're almost always not even at cross purposes, but I mean, I think about it like, like, let's say I get an interview with, like, Jeff Bezos, right? And I can write like a 15,000 word bio on him. And I don't know, I mean, like, you'll learn some stuff, but I don't think, like, I don't really think it's an insight into much. Like, it doesn't really tell you much about the way he thinks or the way, I'm not really sure. I mean, I don't really know if there's a solution to all this. I'm not asking you to have the answers.
No, that's a good point. I mean, you won't get the whole story just talking to, the corporate titan. You'll get this version of the story.
Yeah, because I always feel bad. Like, I'll try to interview people at those companies, and, like, there are a lot of questions I'd ask, But they all tend to be the kind of question you'd ask at the end, where if they're upset and want to cut it short, they can. I feel like any insight is better than no insight, but maybe that's not the appropriate way to be thinking about it. I mean, do you think hearing more from management or hearing more from people who run companies that are exploitive, like, is that even really part of the solution?
I think hearing more from actually not management.
Yeah.
And management, and you know, there's no shortage of business profiles.
Right.
So that, I don't think that's a problem. But what there is a shortage of is hearing from, you know, people at the grassroots level and what their experience is working in that organization. I mean, you know, and part of that is it's easy to write a story and place a story about Jeff Bezos because he's well known, and there's a built-in kind of readership for that just because he's well known.
Right.
And so so because of that, we know about the sex and marital life of Jeff Bezos, but we don't know it about lower level workers at Amazon because no one knows them and no one cares about that. But I think there is something about talking to workers. I mean, one of the best stories about Amazon, in recent years was actually a story about what was happening, inside distribution warehouses several years ago. It still happens apparently in some, but it was the horrible working conditions that people were paid, low wages, that it was incredibly hot. They didn't want to turn on the air conditioning because it was too expensive. People were passing out, and it's like, and that it actually took, someone, getting that story probably with a great deal of difficulty to let us know what was happening. So we don't think about that. We know who Bezos is, and we know, the Amazon packages with the little arrow smiley face that we get on them, but we don't know what happens in between. And that, and the conditions that was a great story, a really important story, about, what's become, the number one retailer in America. And that's, so, I mean, more of those kinds of stories are really important to talk about. There was another story that was actually really good. It was about, and I forget who wrote it, but it was a few years ago about the kind of younger executive culture at Amazon. And it sounded a lot like actually the gaming industry, about how they were expected to put in lots and lots of extra hours and overtime, and people, would hardly see their spouses that worked at Amazon, who were these young executives, just because, it was just kind of expected that you would just put in incredible hours. And the pressure, it was a lot of pressure, and eventually people just started, getting out of that and trying to go to another place because it was so hard. And not that they weren't competent people, but it was so hard because what was expected of them in terms of hours and working conditions was ridiculous. And those were two really great stories because they talked to people who weren't, and they were hard stories to get too because Amazon's very secretive.
Right.
But they were hard stories to get, but talking to people who aren't the CEO or founder, or those stories are really, really important. And those tend to be, important stories, about labor ultimately. So I think there are good stories like that to tell, but it's, definitely not doing, the easy one-off with the CEO.
Right. And through this work that I've done, I don't know. Like, I feel like I've met a lot of those people on the grassroots level, although a lot of them, many of them are civilians, and many of them are people who have just quit the industry because, this is sort of this is a trend I've noticed, is that people who quit the video game industry find they can work elsewhere in tech or in software, work less, get paid more, have better work-life balance, and are just like within a year are immediately happier. And I'm sure I'm hearing about many of the extremes, but I hear from a lot of people who are not in the media, many people who are not in the game industry. And I always wonder, what can people not in the media do? Like, they know, I have a Patreon for my thing. Like, people know, you support independent work. You subscribe to the magazines or the newspapers that you read. Like what else can people who, don't have skin in the game other than, they care about the people who make the things that are in their lives? Like what else can they do other than give money?
Yeah, that's a good. So the people who would be like the customers of the business, or fans of the business.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's not really, there's not a lot they can do. I mean, they can give money to, unions that might be organizing the people if they're concerned about that. But there's not, if there's not a lot of organization, it's hard to figure out like how to play a role in that. There's not really, that's not really much to do. I mean, you could support if there would be some kind of legislation, but again, when there's not stories coming out, there's so that's not not a lot of optimism in that response, but it talks about how these things are difficult. So you need movement, on the labor front and or movement on the politics front. Politicians tend not to move unless there is already something that kind of makes them move first. So again, it comes back around to labor, I mean, there could be a consumers group that's concerned about that, but but that in that industry, it might be hard to do. I don't know if people are as interested and organized that they would want to do a boycott or anything like that. I mean, that would be hard. Again, there would need to be some kind of organization of the workers in the industry to kind of push that.
Yeah, I mean, there was a story. I just think people don't really think about it. Like I've observed, people sort of treat video games as like a renewable resource. Like I always think of it as like water out of the tap or something. They just don't think about it. And as the years have gone on, like I get that, it's entertainment. People want to unplug. They don't want to think about it. They got enough stuff going on in their lives. But like there was a story last year about one particular video game that had really above and beyond horrible conditions, but like I spent the last year writing a book, and I talked to a couple people. I don't think this is in the book because my book's not so much about labor per se, but like it would come up in conversation, and like nobody didn't buy it. There were no boycotts that we heard of. So and then this was this time last year. So I don't know. I hate to circle back on optimism. I just wonder, like, You've dug into this across a much longer timeline than I have, and across many more industries than I have. Although I'm doing the best I can where I can. I mean, do you feel like can we dig ourselves out, like, or is this work that we can only start, and maybe future generations will be the one that'll carry the ball further?
Yeah, it might. I think it's worth starting and creating a public record about what's going on. I think that's a really important base to build on. It might take something more kind of cataclysmic in a way. I mean, think about like things that are brewing under the surface sometimes come to light when there's something really important, kind of a symbolic action. So you think about the Me Too or Black Lives Matter. I mean, it took like a certain case to make those things happen and to kind of get them off the ground. One of the things about I should add about the digital game industry that's kind of disadvantageous to organizing is the fact that and you probably know this better than I do, but there's a lot of younger people in it, and there's I teach in a journalism and media program, and I see this as well. I mean, my students are willing to come out and do almost anything for their first job, and they have boundless energy, and they would just want to work in a cool place.
Right.
And I think the entertainment industry, including the gaming industry, is kind of like that. They're places that they can get in, on the ground floor. They'll just do anything it takes. And when you're young and in your 20s, you're willing to do that a lot. And it's not until you start thinking about you get older and more experienced, and you're thinking about having a family or you have children, then you start to really think about the long-term viability of that. So the entertainment industry, and even in some cases the journalism industry, has kind of depended upon these people to carry it. And a lot of people get burnt out after a while, then they go on to something else. But there's this never-ending supply of young people.
Yeah.
It's not a good way, to organize an industry when you have people when you have huge demand, a huge labor supply. and because people want to get into this industry and then they drop out and you don't have any consistency. You tend to have better organizing when everyone's on the same page and they want to be in that industry for a long time, and they realize that the only way to change things is to kind of take power into their own hands and organize. But it's so when people opt out instead of doubling down and organizing, it makes it very difficult to have change in an industry because they just think, well, we can just get that new college grad to fill into this spot. So that becomes kind of a ongoing exploitation. I mean, if people stop taking those jobs for some change or something unfortunately horrible happen, then you'd start to see things change a little bit. I think, at least in terms of gender relations, I think the Gamergate was kind of that story for the industry because something really horrible happened, and and then we started talking about it. Then we started hearing a lot more stories that were similar to that. So it might. That sounds really horrible, but it might take something like that, something that really calls attention to say, hey, wow, this is a really bad situation here. It could be a horrible thing. It could be people that decide to protest in a certain case, and there's always something, that could actually make that into a story that kind of breaks out.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I know we're wrapping up. I mean, I don't know. Like last around Labor Day, there were actually, for the first time, there were accusations of sexual misconduct against individuals, and individuals were named. And that happened maybe on a Wednesday or Thursday. And I think on that Saturday, one of those people committed suicide.
Oh, wow.
And it was, I had the ear of someone at the New York Times and had said, hey, we should... I don't know if you'd be up for this. Like, I'd like to write an op-ed, or maybe there's something we could write about it. This was before the suicide, and then the suicide happened, and I emailed them again. And I said, hey, there's been an update. There's been a development. And I never heard from them. And it was just interesting. A lot of my colleagues noticed, really, there's not one person at any mainstream place that, is available or interested in writing about this. So... I don't know. Yeah. I agree with you. I know it's not an optimistic thing to say. I think that, unfortunately, the way that our culture seems to function is that we need something bad to happen before we can take stock of how bad we've let it get and then try to focus on doing better. So This is just one of many frontiers where that's true, I think.
Yeah, it might be that, I mean, I think you could say that about us politically, too, as a nation.
I was intentionally being vague, but it applies to everything,
Yeah. There might be some, I don't know if there's some magazines that might be interested in looking more closely at this, like, The Nation, or on the West, like in these times, or there's a labor publication out of Detroit, Labor Notes. I mean, they might, maybe you've already written some things for them or talked to them. But
no, I mean, I don't really want to get into specifics. I mean, The Nation is funny because a couple of years ago they were on that list, and I was able to get somebody on the phone because I was told it was better to just pitch on the phone. And I was shooed off the phone within a minute, and then I tried them again a couple of weeks ago, and I don't know. They weren't interested because they said, "Oh, we have somebody else writing a story on staff." I mean, I think that's a serious consideration is the budget, and none of these things are in a vacuum. What I've come to learn, and maybe you agree or disagree, I don't think there's some magic sequence of words you can tell an editor that's going to, make them want to go for a story that that they historically haven't covered. So I don't really think that's necessarily my fault. It's just, it's again a function of that thing of let's just see how bad things have to get before we're willing to take a look.
Yeah. Well, I would just say, keep writing about it, and I read some of your work after you contacted me. It's really interesting, and I think it's important stuff. So
thank you.
I'm glad you're out there talking about it, and hopefully other people will be as well. But when something happens, I think people certainly will come to you. I mean, the media is kind of fickle that way. Like they ignore something, then as soon as something bigger happens, they want someone who who's been on that beat for a while to kind of explain it to them. So.
Well, we'll see. I don't know how coherent I'll be by then.
Yeah.
But I thank you so much for your time. I'm gonna just go ahead and hit stop.